You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 16th of April, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
China tags in a new trade negotiator. Hamas rejects an Israeli ceasefire offer, but was that the idea? And the country rejoicing at its first ATM. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel Hilton and Yossi Mekelberg will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll meet the author Richard Susskind, who has been thinking about AI longer than most of us. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, international journalist and visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute and founder of China Dialogue, and Yossi Mekelberg, associate fellow with the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. I think that's our panellists with the two longest job descriptions on the one programme, and that's all we have time for. Isabel and Yossi, thank you both for joining us. The Daily returns tomorrow at the same time. No, but seriously, Yossi, you have recently, I should ask if you can actually hear me. You've recently been attending a concert by a legendarily raucous rock band.
Yeah, luckily it's 2 weeks later, so I regained my capacity to hear anyone. No, it was actually great performance. And it's nice to see, in a world that everyone thinks it belongs to young people and youth, it's nice to see people that reach their ninth decade and they can still rock.
The band in question, The Who, obviously. When you looked around you when they reached the inevitable line in my generation about hope I die before I get old, is there a certain amount of arch-knowing chuckles among the audience?
No, and you know what was surprising? There was actually relatively, in relative terms, much younger audience than the band itself.
Well, I mean, the US Supreme Court's younger than The Who at this point.
Yeah, which is an achievement. But it's nice to see that people probably, as 30, 40 years younger, still can rock to this kind of tunes. So, they're a state of legend in rock. So I think, and it was also for a good cause, because it was for charity to raise, for cancer charity for children and for hospitals. So it was also for a good cause. But I think the music, to be honest, 2 hours of the old The Who music was entertaining.
Well, was this the show at which there was on-stage beef? Because it is being reported today, I could not help but notice that The Who have decided to fire their drummer Zach Starkey, son of Ringo Starr, due to disputes over his performance at the Albert Hall.
There was kind of a slight altercation in the middle of one of the song between Roger Daltrey and I think it looks like the drummer.
Well, that's exactly it.
I think he couldn't hear in his earpiece the music.
Well,
and it was difficult for him to continue the song. But to be honest, both of them recovered, but it seems that the relations are not the same anymore.
Indeed not. And The Who, of course, based their entire legend on their famously subtle drumming. So I can understand why Roger Daltrey's upset. Isabel, you have been attending to matters rather more serious.
Well, yes.
Seamless pivot there.
Well, I mean, yes, one can do this reliving the past in several ways.
That was the link I wanted. Thank you.
In my case, in recent days, it's been a book called Murder in Cairo, which was written by a former colleague of mine, Peter Gilman. We were colleagues on the Sunday Times in the Insight team, and he teamed up with a young journalist called Emanuele Midolo to return to the subject of who killed David Holden, who was murdered in Cairo. He landed at the airport and got in a car, and his body was found 2 days later, dumped by the side of the road. He was at the time the Sunday Times' chief foreign correspondent. And a great deal of effort went into trying to solve this very strange mystery because, it wasn't a casual killing. The labels on his clothes were torn out. His identifying marks had been, anything that identified him removed from the body. There were 3 cars involved, one of which had been stolen a month before, resprayed. So it was an operation. And the question was, why? Who did it and why did they do it? Anyway, we never got to the bottom of it in the first time around, and Peter picked it up. He was teaching a course on investigative journalism and talking about successes, and then he said, and there's one we never cracked. It was a failure. And one of the students then in the class then kind of got in touch with them sometime later. It had Harry Evans, who'd been editor of the Sunday Times, never really forgot it and always wanted to know. Anyway, they returned to it. They discovered a great deal more, including a staggering degree of collaboration between newspapers and the security services on all sides, which was a bit of a shock to me. And they came down with a very plausible, strong thesis, actually.
And that book, I think, was mentioned by another of his former colleagues, Michael Binion, on a recent daily as well. But that title, one more time?
Murder in Cairo.
Very much recommended. We start tonight, however, with the US-China trade war, and with the usual caveat that this is a consideration of the state of play as of this broadcast, given the downright whimsical nature of the decision-making of US President Donald Trump. Anything might have happened between now and listeners catching up on podcast. Seriously, we can't help you. The latest mail, anyway, is that China has effected a switch, benching its venerable trade negotiator, the Vice Commerce Minister Wang Xiaowen, and sending on former Assistant Commerce Minister Li Changgang. Meanwhile, China has posted another of its eyebrow-arching GDP growth updates, claiming a 5.4% better first quarter than last year, but this obviously does not account for the impact of Trump's tariffs. Isabel, to do whatever, first of all, is the Chinese equivalent of Kremlinology, how big a deal is this switch between Mr. Wang and Mr. Li?
Well, Mr. Li is younger, and he does have he's got a very solid, respectable career in trade all through the kind of bureaucratic organs. He's been ambassador at the WTO. He knows his stuff. Whether he'll find anyone to talk to in Washington who is equally well prepared is another matter. But I think it's a signal that China keeps sending up little signals saying we're just here quietly, prepared to talk when we get someone reasonable to talk to, and this is another of those signals. I mean, as far as the trade, as the economy, the economic figures go, I mean, they don't really mean very much because the first quarter growth, took place before the tariffs. But also, if you look at the component parts of that growth, it actually illustrates all the problems in the Chinese economy rather than any solutions. So the growth derives from exports, industrial output up 6.3%, investment in industry up. I think it was 9.1%. Now those are aspects of the Chinese economy that are already overproducing. That's the problem. They need to sell this stuff. And actually this kind of stimulus to the Chinese economy by going on producing things that you don't have a market for is part of the problem. And the consumption side of these figures was unimpressive. So what China needs to do in the short term, if it's going to be cut off from the American market, is to grow the appetite at home for greater consumption. And they've been trying to do that for 10 years, and it's tough.
Yossi, there is quite the dilemma here for China, of course. I mean, I'm sure Isabel's right when she said this is a signal that, hey, we're right over here if anyone wants to have a serious chat. But China has also, of course, imposed retaliatory tariffs against the United States. Might China also be thinking, as China, I think, often does, that we operate on a different timescale to these flibbity-gibbet Western democracies? We can just whack up our retaliatory tariffs and we can just ride this out. We will wait for the United States to basically implode.
Obviously, Isabel knows China well better than me, but I think, yes, they have the time on their side, especially as the United States picks up so many fights at the same time. And then from China point of view, they don't have all this fight. Here, this, Iran, maybe a war in Iran, Greenland, Panama, Ukraine, you name it, is in a fight. Mm-hmm. And the way that Trump behaves remind me an Armenian proverb: "The fool can throw a stone in pond that otherwise men cannot get it out." And not that I ever call it American president a fool.
Perish the thought.
Yes, but so he does something, and then we all kind of what has he done? Does it make any sense? So 105% tariff here, 120%, which once it will, no one is going to export with this kind of tariffs. But I think in this sense, China can bide its time, because that's what Europe is now, is reorganizing. The Middle East, when it comes to Gaza, think differently about their role, because all the world is now trying to deal with this. Because his way of negotiation doesn't understand that there is always an alternative to negotiation. There are two very boring terms in negotiation called Batna and Zopa. And they're about the best alternative to a negotiated agreement and the zone of possible agreement. And what he is doing is completely outside this both terms. So at this point, say, maybe it's better for us, wait and see, look for alternative market, try to develop market at home. And as you suggested, the United States will implode eventually if it keeps picking all these fights.
There's another nice proverb involving a stone, which has been invoked in China for Trump's behaviour, which is a man who picks up a heavy stone only to drop it on his own foot.
Isabel, there has, however, been some hugely entertaining huffing and puffing from various official Chinese sources, turning earlier, as I so often do, to the op-ed pages of the China Daily, which is generally regarded as very much its master's voice. I read that the US should, and I quote, stop whining about itself being a victim in global trade. Also very much enjoying the Deputy Commissioner at the National Bureau of Statistics, Mr. Sheng Liuyun, harumphing the tariffs, and again, I quote, violate the economic laws and principles of the World Trade Organization. That is some fancy talk coming from the People's Republic, isn't it?
Certainly is. In fact, one of their early moves in this particular dispute was to complain to the WTO, which I thought was quite...
It's glorious.
Yeah, it is pretty glorious. Clearly these tariffs are going to hurt China. They're quietly confident that they're going to hurt the United States more than they're going to hurt China, in the sense that there are different politics in the United States, and once the hapless US consumer finds that everything is twice as expensive, or indeed the Midwest farmers find that they can't sell their corn, they're counting on Trump, executing another U-turn. And the great gift that Trump has given Xi Jinping is that anything that goes wrong in China can now be blamed on Donald Trump. And he has made it much easier for Xi Jinping to go and talk to Vietnam and Malaysia and indeed the European Union. He's getting much more of a hearing than he did before. So on the whole, the advantage so far is to China.
Well, that would appear to be then the Chinese equivalent of Donald Trump's single-handed rescue of the Canadian Liberal Party and the Australian Labor Party,
Indeed.
Both of whom he is about to get re-elected.
Indeed.
But the interesting thing is some of what Trump complains are not baseless.
True.
When you're talking about intellectual property, about messing with currency, it's sometimes the style of how he's doing that.
Well, and the remedy.
Yeah, exactly. Which is sometimes worse than the disease.
Exactly.
So that will kill eventually the patient. Otherwise, if any normal administration comes and we want to negotiate with you about intellectual property, and we'll be tough in this negotiation, there is room to do that. Talking about how you manipulate currencies, okay, there is room for negotiation. But when you inflict 145%, this is the end of negotiation, because this is the end of trade. It's about the style, about sometimes the pace and the measure that they try to inflict in this kind of situation.
Well, as someone said of him, it's reliably the wrong answer to the right question.
Well, on a related thought, to Gaza, where Hamas appears to have rejected the terms of a ceasefire proposed by Israel. Israel's pitch was that Hamas would free 10 more of the hostages they have held since October 2023 in return for the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and detainees held in Israeli jails amid a 45-day ceasefire ceasefire to negotiate a permanent truce which would include, and this seems to have been the sticking point, the disarmament of Gaza, including, obviously, Hamas. Meanwhile, Israel's renewed offensive against Gaza has continued. Earlier today, one person was killed and 9 more injured in an airstrike on a field hospital in Khan Yunis. Yossi, was this one of those offers you make so you can say you made an offer? You don't really expect the other party to say yes.
It's sometimes negotiation for the sake of negotiation. And we know that by now that we could have been beyond all this hostage crisis for many, many months, and the Israeli government had no interest in that, because in order to preserve Netanyahu's position as prime minister, keep this coalition government, the war needs to continue until, whatever it means, the absolute victory. And we hear it for 18 months now, and a year ago Netanyahu said that we were one step away from total victory. We are a year later. 59 hostages, we don't know how many of them alive. This is not to exonerate Hamas and its cruelty and its cynicism and the way it treats the hostages. But it's about the commitment of the Israeli government to release hostages, because there is a commitment and there is an ethos in the Israeli society to look after the hostages. Now, the question is, do we really want to go again into this phased agreement of another 45 days for 10, or to have actually to go for the big move? All the hostages for the end of war. Now, what the Hamas doesn't want is to disarm. And in many ways, we are in a situation, makes it so difficult, is again, going back to the Zopa and Batna of before in this negotiation, is the end of the war might bring the end both of Hamas and the Netanyahu government. So at certain point, they want to bring an end to a war, but it's not necessarily in their interest to preserve their own power.
But is this the closest signal, Isabel, we have yet had to what Netanyahu does perceive as the end of the war? Because there is, of course, cynicism on both sides of this conflict. Netanyahu, I think, if he's not all that bothered by the possibility that Israel may have killed 50,000 people, is not going to be much concerned by 60,000 or 70,000. He is determined that this ends when Hamas come out with their hands up. At some point, is Hamas going to have to internalise that?
I agree with Yossi that I don't think either side has an interest at this point in ending this. They've both got too much to lose. You know, to end. We don't think that Netanyahu wants to end the war. Everything he's done for the last, 10 years has been to create an enemy that he can pretend to fight, and in this case, really fight. He has a long record of not negotiating with reasonable interlocutors and striking reasonable deals. And he's gone more and more to the extreme side. His political survival and his survival, more than his political survival, his survival as a free individual depends on maintaining a state of emergency. I can't see him ever being, unless he is forced to, and I'm not sure what would force him, I can't see this ever being a good faith offer.
Well, is there perhaps, Yossi, just finally on this, because I suspect we will depressingly have ample opportunity to return to it, is there an idea lurking somewhere in the Israeli high command that if we make life as abject and as miserable as we possibly can, and this goes to Defense Minister Israel Katz's comments in the last couple of days about how and why Israel are just not going to admit humanitarian aid to Gaza, are they hoping that at some point the broad mass of Palestinian people rise up against Hamas?
This is the illusion for the last 20 years. The idea of the blockade, the original, since 2006, we make their life miserable or misery, and they will stand up against Hamas. It hasn't happened until now. And at the end of the day, it's not that the people of Gaza, probably now supporting Hamas, where there are people demonstrating, protesting against Hamas recently, many of them, or at least some of them.
Which is a brave move.
It's a very brave move that some of them paid with their life for this and being tortured. So in this kind of situation, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, between the IDF and between Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which is not a nice place to be. At the same time, without humanitarian aid, and we hear from with some of the humanitarian aid agencies that food is running out. What Israel Katz said today about humanitarian aid amount to a war crime, preventing people of humanitarian aid. This is the responsibility of Israel. So that's 2.3 people are stuck there. But there is another point. Since Trump started talking about a Riviera and legitimized, normalized, talking about expelling 2.3 million people, that's exactly what it was music to the ears of the right in Israel. And they tell Netanyahu, are you against it? While the President of the United States, this is our time to do that. And this is the scary thing.
Well, to Angola now, which advertently or otherwise appears bent on demonstrating the conundrum which often forestalls attempts to combat mis- and or disinformation, i.e. that the line between honestly policing and actively preventing the public discourse is often a thin one. Angola is proposing up to 10 years in the clink for those who knowingly disseminate fake news, but, and listeners may have guessed where this is going, Angola's government is among the last bunch of people you'd want defining the term. Reporters Sans Frontieres' most recent Press Freedom Index ranks Angola 104th in the world. The most recent recipient of the International Press Institute's World Press Freedom Hero Award was Angolan journalist Rafael Marques, who won it substantially for being a journalist in Angola. Isabel, Angolans should probably be somewhat suspicious of this?
Well, I think they probably don't need us to tell them that. Look, but the depressing thing is, yes, you can clearly see what this is. It's, a suppression of views you don't like. Call them fake news. Who else has been doing that recently? I wonder.
I cannot think.
And it's, Russia does it too. You kind of lock it up. It's quite. Nobody stands up and says, "I am going to suppress views that I don't like." But as long as you attach another label to it, they are fake, they are traitorous, they are, unpatriotic, you can get away with it, at least, nominally. But no, this is a kind of transparent manoeuvre.
Nevertheless, Yossi, roughly 78 countries do have laws of some sort or another against fake news, some in better faith than others. Are they all wrong? Is there a way governments can impose a certain amount of what we might think of as hygiene on the general information environment?
Again, I think we are still in the experimental stage of dealing with social media and how it's spreading very quickly fake news. But of course, imposing 10 years, this is a very slippery slope. Mm-hmm. When you're just putting every political opponent or everyone you just dislike in jail for spreading whatever they think is fake news. Who is deciding what is fake news and what is not fake news? Mm-hmm. Who is standing there, on this pedestal and decide this? But I think that's one of the problems. Every one of us that read anything on Twitter and think, this can't be true, this must be fake, and we know there is a lot of that. But the question, what's the remedy for that? And this, I think, calls for national and international dialogues. Are we monitor? But we see exactly the opposite, because in the United States, they go exactly in the opposite direction. Everything can go. We don't have any monitoring of information because that's what the president wants. And all these people that worked day in, day out, and watching actually some horrible things to prevent us from saying that, are basically out of job.
I mean, is there, and this is a thought I know we have explored on this show before, Isabel, could there be some sort of way, or should there be some sort of way in which social media platforms are regarded as what I actually think they are, which is publishers, and they should be no more or less responsible for anything that appears on their platform, as, for example, a newspaper is for what it puts in the letters to the editor column? Absolutely.
And if you're talking about, the press and fake news, there are the law courts. You can sue. You can, bring a case to court. You can supply your evidence, and you can fight it out. Of course, the publishers, which I agree, the big internet companies are publishers and ought to be treated in the same way. And this is a row that's kind of beginning to build up between the European Union and the United States, because the European Union has been more robust in terms of responsibility of the online platforms. And one of the things that Trump particularly objects to about Europe, or Trump and his cohorts, is the fact that they wish to regulate the platforms. So that's another battle that we're seeing. Trump himself has, led or encouraged the platforms to dismantle, as Musk has done, all the kind of safeguards of that there used to be on Twitter, now X, and that it's part of a political project to do that. It's not just, you threaten 10 years in jail for fake news. What that does is that nobody knows what the line is. Nobody knows what's safe and what isn't. And so silence falls. You have a much broader impact than any individual cases.
I mean, just a final thought, though, on this, Yossi. Is there any argument that the laws we do have are actually sufficient? They just should be more rigorously applied. There were instances, obviously, in the UK last summer of people ending up in jail for their social media-based contributions to race riots.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, if it's about hatred, spreading hatred and other incitement, I think the law, as you said, they are publishers, so they have the same responsibility to that. I think one of the problems is the magnitude and how much of this information there. If you're going to sue almost everyone that spread fake news, there are not enough judges in the world, there are not enough courts in the world, and you see this, it happens more and more. So part of it is education, part of it is changing the discourse. But when there is the case of inciting to violence, then I think the existing legislation should be applied.
Well, to Tuvalu now, and a big hello to all our listeners in Fongafale, Funafuti, Alapi and Sanala. The talk of all these towns is the unveiling in Vaiaku of the Pacific Archipelago's first ATM. Tuvalu's first electronic transaction was attended by the Prime Minister, Governor-General and other dignitaries, and is genuinely a big moment for Tuvalu, hitherto an extremely old-school cash economy, including queues at the bank on payday so that workers can get their mitts on their salary. Next leap forward will be credit cards. Do any of us, Isabel, who can probably remember it, I think I can say that for all of us, miss anything about the old school cash economy?
I do quite miss cash, actually. I still use cash in order to keep it in circulation. I like those shiny and rather clean notes. They used to be a lot grubbier, but now so few people use cash that the notes are rather clean. And
this isn't some paranoid foil-hatted they can't trace me if I use cash thing?
It isn't really. It's also the fact that, we have far more beggars on the streets than we used to, and it's very, you kind of need change, unless you're a hard-hearted person, which on the whole I'm not. And unlike the beggars in China who now have QR codes, because it really is a cashless society, our beggars don't, and so they need money, real money.
And I was really happy. I had a note of £5 today on the tube when I came here. And there was a guy that really looked in need of that, and he played the harmonica on the way. And I was so happy that in a rare occasion, I actually had the £5 note in this. But another thing was a really watershed for me when it comes to cash this week. I went to wash the car, and usually I know that I need cash for that, and the guy came with the card machine. And this was the first time I could pay with a card in one of these places. So if they can, probably cash is a thing of the past, unless you're in some islands.
See, I can also remember, Isabel, travelling back when it was necessary to go through no end of nonsense with things like travellers' checks and bureaus de change and confusing yourself trying to figure out. I remember, basically ruining an afternoon in Italy by not being entirely sure whether I just paid, I think, 150 quid for quite a nice leather jacket or 1,500 quid for quite a nice leather jacket. Mercifully, it turned out to be the former once I figured it out. But I just thought, God, how many zeros are there here?
Don't ever go to Japan. They have even more zeros.
Indeed. Extremely confusing. But it's now pretty possible to travel to a lot of places just waving cards at things. I was in Greece last week, Germany a few weeks before that. I don't think I used any cash on either trip. But have you in recent times overestimated the cashlessness of a society? I did when I got to Belgrade last November and found the taxi drivers at the airport much keener on cash.
Yes, that can happen. That happened in Budapest actually last week. But the other thing you can do, probably like you, Andrew, I have a drawer full of probably dead banknotes.
I have loads.
I have a lot of dead currency. Yeah. And every now and then I take them, if I'm going to Sweden, I dig out the krona and discover that that particular version hasn't been in circulation.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for them to become collector's items at this point.
Absolutely. There was a famous restaurant in Buenos Aires when in one of the many cycles of rapid inflation in Argentina, which had an entire wall wallpapered with dead currencies.
Just finally on this, Yossi, are there circumstances in which you actively prefer cash? The one that strikes me is when I go back to Australia around every Christmas, I usually go with my dad to the races. It just seems weird not to do that by going up to the tote window and placing my pitifully small bets in cash and collecting my very occasional winnings the same way.
Yeah, I think we reveal our age when we're saying things like this, that we become nostalgic on the way we used to do that. Probably if you ask the younger generation, the only thing they know is card, and probably not card anymore, but they pay with a phone, which is sort of a card. So I think, 10, 15 years is a cash what?
Exactly. In 10, 15 years from now, we'll just have a chip implanted in our foreheads. Isabel Hilton and Yossi Meckelberg, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, whether it is ChatGPT writing your emails or Google's more recent AI model that purportedly decodes dolphin language, artificial intelligence has well and truly arrived. And if the trillions of dollars being ploughed into it is any indication, it is not going away. The Scottish author and independent advisor Richard Susskind has spent the last 40 years developing AI systems for lawyers, advising governments on AI policy, and generally being a great deal more informed on the subject than most pundits populating our social media feeds. Monocle's Gunnar Gronlid sat down with Richard earlier to talk about his new book, How to Think About AI, and began by asking how he broke into the field so many decades ago.
Hard to believe, I know, looking at me, but I've been in the AI business for 44 years. And interestingly, I think more has happened in the last 4 years than the 4 decades that preceded it. I was a law student in Glasgow University, and I was asking myself the question, might computers replace judges? All my avenues of research led to this field of artificial intelligence, of which I'd never heard. And I became immediately hooked, and then went down to Oxford University to do my PhD on AI and law in the early mid-80s. And I've really spent most of my career thinking about the way in which these increasingly capable systems might affect us, both for good and ill.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand, you were even involved in building the first AI company for law.
It was the first AI system for lawyers, and it was over a third of a century ago, and it answered the question, when can I no longer raise an action in courts because too much time has passed in law actions go stale? I worked with the leading expert in the country, and we developed a system that in the end was better than him, answering a really complicated legal question. So we showed it was possible to reduce law to code more than 30 years ago.
Well, that's what's interesting about reading your book, because you show in this sort of history of AI that AI has been very capable in different ways for a very long time. And yet I think for myself and anyone who wasn't looking at that space, we were all whiplashed by the release of ChatGPT in late 2022. Why do you think we were so unprepared for where we are now?
And many computer scientists were surprised by it too, and whiplash is a good way of capturing the rapidity with which it landed upon us. Quite phenomenal. I think 2 aspects to it. First of all, the bot aspect, that here was a system that could interact with us in a very human-like way. I'm sure when you use it, you're the same as me. I find myself saying please and thank you, and sometimes wanting to apologise to it for troubling. And it's really bizarre that. So the level of conversation is remarkable, and you really do feel you're interacting with something highly capable. But secondly, the ability to generate, whether it be text or images or music, or indeed even generate code, the level at which it's performing has really surprised the community. And this immediately has shown some intensely practical applications. So in the 80s, when we were involved, it was very much R&D, and we were speculating about how it might affect the market. But if you look now, for example, at governments around the world who are wondering how they can be more efficient and productive, suddenly there's a tool that can summarize documents, draft documents, generate arguments and so forth to a very high standard. And if you look at big businesses all under pressure to reduce their overhead, similarly, we're seeing market appetite for AI. And I think over the next few years, that'll be the dominant use of the technology as a kind of productivity and efficiency tool. After that, something far more dramatic is going to happen. And that'll be when AI systems begin to match and exceed human levels of performance, and then challenge the extent to which we as humans should be involved in various aspects of work.
And yet, as you point out in the book, even following 2022, this kind of not us thinking, as you call it, has persisted even after the ChatGPT was released. It struck me while reading it that AI has almost become a sort of a litmus test to all kinds of psychological biases that we have. Like you speak about researching for your book, The Future of the Professions, how you'd speak to a doctor and he'd absolutely concede that, yes, for accountants and for journalists, this will replace everyone. It will have massive consequences, but not for me. And almost everyone in each of their professions do this. Why do you think that AI has the power to sort of evoke these biases to such a degree that I think is hardly seen in almost any other topic at the moment?
It's funny, isn't it? All sorts of dissonances going on. I don't think there's anything malign at play here. I think for many of us who've spent years, if not decades, devoting ourselves to a particular profession or craft or job, the idea that somehow we're dispensable is really quite disturbing. And we are, I think, emotionally, psychologically, often even morally committed to the way we've always worked. So when doctors and lawyers, for example, say to me in all sincerity that this technology is of little application in their world, what they're often saying is we really do feel our work is irreducibly human, that another human who needs medical help or legal help wants a human face-to-face, not a machine. And I say that we've got to be honest with ourselves and ask when it really is very important to maintain how we do what we do, as opposed to the outcome. So I often say people don't want doctors, they want health. And if through AI we can find cheaper, quicker, more convenient ways of maintaining and improving people's health, doctors should expect no loyalty to the traditional way of delivering health services. And this, of course, is a fundamental impact to the NHS in this country and to health services around the world. We might have fundamentally new and better ways of delivering the outcomes that our citizens need and deserve.
And so far in this conversation, as in the public debate, we have both a sort of dystopian vision of what can happen with AI and a utopian vision of what can happen with AI. And as you point out in the book, when you're going through all these risks and possibilities, most of those are not new. We haven't come up with new risks and possibilities really for decades. Even far back as the 60s, 70s, 80s, people already predicted most of this stuff. So I think the more sort of interesting conversation that I think is becoming a bit shrouded in all the fears and the hopes is, well, if both are possible, the utopia and the dystopia, what kind of questions can we begin to ask ourselves, and what can we actually do now, in your estimation, to actually harness AI in the way we want to?
My book's called How to Think About AI, and one of the main mindsets we require, and you've captured it nicely, is the ability to recognise that AI is and can be used both for good and for ill. People want to belong to Team AI or Team Anti-AI, and I say that's naive. We have to accommodate two thoughts in our minds at the one time, that this could be a set of technologies that could overcome our gravest challenges, our global health challenge, educational challenge, justice challenge, climate challenge. But at the same time, it's bringing a mountain range of risks. That's why I say saving humanity with and from AI is the defining challenge of our generation.
That was Richard Susskind speaking to Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid. Richard's book, How to Think About AI, is available now. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel Hilton and Yossi Meckelberg. The show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.